This is a moment of transformation for my family. Buckingham Palace had issued difficult statements before, but this one struck something deeper than titles, ceremonies, or public obligations. It cut into the royal bloodline itself. Within minutes, senior family members were being quietly informed that the framework governing how descendants of the sovereign would be acknowledged had been fundamentally rewritten. For Prince William, the announcement was far more than constitutional language. It reached directly into the future of his own children. Before we go further into what this truly means for the royal family, make sure you subscribe so you never miss a single update. William received the document during a private briefing and went completely still when he reached the clauses naming Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. The Royal Lineage Protocol, an internal palace framework determining ceremonial rank, symbolic dynastic responsibilities, and who may represent the direct royal line, did not alter who legally inherits the throne, but it redefined who would stand nearest to that future in practice. Direct descendants would now take precedence over spouses, extended relatives, and family members outside active royal service. William pressed the pages flat against the table and asked whether all 3 children were affected right away. The answer was yes. Charles grasped the cost before anyone else gave voice to it. As sovereign, he could follow the logic. Fewer overlapping claims, clearer lines of authority, less opportunity for influence to become inherited power. As a husband and father, the king recognized the same decision would reduce the institutional standing of those closest to him. That tension sharpened when William reached the clause separating bloodline representation from marital representation. Put plainly, marriage could place someone alongside the crown, but it would no longer guarantee ceremonial authority over the generation that came next. William read the final page a second time. Then he closed the folder. The private secretary watched as the prince asked a single question. Who requested the final clause be changed? The response came without hesitation. His Majesty. That answer struck harder than the protocol itself, because the file had been altered late the previous night. Charles had personally approved the revision hours before it was made public, and nobody could explain what had driven him to act. Camilla grasped immediately what the others were only beginning to understand. The queen consort recognized that the new wording did not simply protect William's children. It drew a boundary around how far a royal spouse could extend their reach into the following generation. She demanded to know whether her position beside Charles had just been quietly redefined without her knowledge. And before William could find out why his father had rewritten the rules, she was already moving toward the confrontation that would expose what this decision had truly been designed to prevent permanently. The announcement appeared clinical on palace paper. Inside the family, it felt anything but. William saw protection for his children. Camilla saw restrictions tightening around her. Charles saw consequences he had postponed, confronting for years. And Catherine understood almost immediately that the most significant element of the decision was not who stood closer to the throne today, but who would be permitted to speak for the monarchy tomorrow. William felt no sense of victory. As the direct heir, he recognized the revised structure now placed Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis at the center of the monarchy's future order. George stood first among his children in succession, followed by Charlotte and then Louis. But the new rules extended beyond inheritance. They also determined who could shape future royal duties and dynastic representation. Catherine remained a powerful presence beside her husband, yet the protocol now drew a sharper distinction between the role obtained through marriage and the by identity passed down to their children. Catherine noticed the tension before William said a word. During a private exchange, the prince admitted that what concerned him most was George. He did not want his eldest son carrying heavier burdens simply because the adults around him had failed to resolve questions of authority. She understood at once. Their children were receiving protection, but protection within a royal family could easily become another form of pressure. William wanted clear boundaries. He did not want a childhood transformed into preparation for conflict. Camilla viewed the same document through an entirely different lens. She placed the protocol on Charles's desk and tapped the disputed paragraph with one finger. The queen consort had spent years standing beside him through public hostility, private strain, and the full weight of royal duty. Now she wanted to know whether all of that could be reduced to a rule stating that marriage brought closeness to the crown without lasting dynastic authority. She looked directly at him. Was this written because of me? Charles did not reply immediately. The king looked down at the page, then back at her. It was written because we waited too long. That sentence unsettled her more than a denial would have. When she pressed him on whether the protocol had been designed to prevent a future consort from influencing decisions involving William's children, he refused to offer a simple answer. His silence suggested the rule had been born from something far more personal than palace planning. Catherine discovered the clue later. One paragraph referred specifically to descendants born within the sovereign line, wording so precise she believed it could only have followed a genuine dispute. William reached the same conclusion. Someone had crossed a boundary before this document came into existence, and Charles's answer pointed them both back to Windsor, to a private confrontation months earlier that everyone had tried to put behind them. the moment when a single argument about George's future became the point of no return. Long before Buckingham Palace confirmed the new rules, the fracture had already formed. It came during a private family gathering at Windsor, well away from cameras and formal occasions. What started as a discussion about Prince George's future responsibilities became something far more serious. A dispute over who held the right to shape the next generation of the monarchy. Everyone later remembered one sentence. Everyone remembered who spoke it. Charles had initially wanted flexibility. As George moved closer to taking on more visible duties, the king believed trusted senior relatives could help guide William's children without rigid rules surrounding them. Those discussions covered who might attend future briefings, who could offer counsel to the young heir, and how George, Charlotte, and Louis would gradually be introduced to royal responsibility. In simple terms, those briefings were private sessions where senior family members and advisors prepared younger royals for the duties they might one day carry. Charles saw cooperation in all of it. William increasingly saw blurred lines. Camilla eventually tested those boundaries during the Windsor discussion. The Queen Consort argued that future consorts and senior spouses should retain an advisory voice even after the crown passed to the next generation. She framed it as continuity, not control. Years of service, she maintained, should not simply vanish when one reign concluded and another began. William reacted immediately. The prince pushed his chair back and said with chilling calm, "My children are not a committee." He made it clear that decisions involving George, Charlotte, and Louis belonged first to their parents and later to the direct sovereign line. Charles attempted to contain the damage. The king urged both sides to separate family feeling from institutional power, but the argument had already turned personal. Camilla asked whether she would one day be treated as temporary within the very history she had helped build. William did not soften. He feared that leaving influence undefined would allow future households to compete for position around his children. Camilla heard something colder, that marriage could bring decades of dedication and still end with the door quietly closing. Anne had barely spoken, but she understood where the true danger lay. After William departed, the Princess Royal remained with her brother and, according to a documented private account prepared for the later Palace Review, told Charles plainly, "Now you understand why this needs to be written down." She warned that unwritten expectations could become rival claims after his reign, particularly when personal loyalty collided with succession. Charles acted that same evening. He requested the first draft of what would become the Royal Lineage Protocol. Yet that early version was far softer than the one Buckingham Palace eventually confirmed. Something occurred after Windsor. Something persuaded the king that compromise was no longer sufficient. And months later, those buried words would surface again when William and Camilla finally stood face to face over the final version Charles had chosen. The new protocol had barely been confirmed when the private confrontation everyone had feared finally arrived. No advisors sat between them. No press secretary shaped the language. William entered knowing Camilla believed the document diminished her. Camilla entered believing William had encouraged the restrictions. For several tense minutes, the future king and the queen consort stood on opposite sides of a decision neither could pretend was merely administrative. William had requested the meeting himself. After hearing that she questioned whether he had influenced the final wording, Charles agreed to keep aides outside, believing another formal briefing would only transform personal resentment into something far harder to repair. The disputed issue concerned future lineage councils, private groups, designed to advise on how younger heirs are prepared for royal duty and how authority transitions between generations. This mattered because any permanent seat on such a council could become an enduring source of influence around George, Charlotte, and Louis. Camilla did not conceal her anger. The queen consort told William she had spent years accepting public limitations, absorbing criticism, and standing beside Charles without demanding control over everything surrounding the crown. But she would not accept being treated privately, as though her marriage carried no lasting place in the dynasty. William listened, then replied with equal restraint. The prince said the question was not whether she mattered to his father. It was whether anyone outside the direct line could claim authority over his children. Once they began carrying constitutional responsibilities, Camilla then revealed a detail William had never seen. According to an earlier documented palace draft, royal spouses had been granted a consultative role in future lineage councils, a provision that would have allowed senior consorts to advise the next generation even after the crown passed forward. The final version had removed it entirely. She looked directly at him and asked, "Did you tell him to take away my role?" William hesitated. Then he answered, "I didn't know you had one to remove." Those words changed everything. Camilla studied him closely and realized the surprise was genuine. He had never seen the earlier provision. He had never pushed for its removal. Her anger remained, but it shifted away from the man standing before her. Charles had done this alone. William grasped the same truth at the same moment. If his father had removed the clause without pressure from him, then something had convinced the king that compromise had become too dangerous. Camilla stopped arguing with William because there was nothing left between them to argue about. The real confrontation had moved elsewhere. And for the first time, both understood that the hardest question was no longer who had lost power, but what Charles had discovered that made him willing to take it away. Charles had spent much of his reign attempting to balance two identities, father and sovereign. The lineage decision made that balance impossible. When William and Camilla separately demanded answers, the king could no longer shelter behind palace wording. He had altered the document himself. He had withdrawn the protection once extended to royal spouses. And now he was finally prepared to explain the fear that led him there. Charles understood precisely where his authority ended. The protocol could shape internal royal representation, ceremonial precedents, access to dynastic briefings, and symbolic responsibilities, but it could not rewrite the legal line of succession established by law. That distinction mattered because the king was not determining who inherited the crown. He was deciding who could claim influence around those who might one day inherit it. William listened carefully because the difference protected George, Charlotte, and Louis without altering their constitutional place. William then heard the deeper fear. The prince asked why his father had withdrawn the spouse provision so late, and Charles admitted he had imagined what might unfold after his death. Personal relationships, he said, could gradually become competing centers of influence if the boundaries remained vague. One household could claim tradition, another loyalty, a third precedent. The king feared leaving his son a monarchy where affection itself became a weapon in disputes over authority. Anne had helped force that realization. According to a confidential memorandum she personally presented to her brother, earlier royal disputes demonstrated how easily undefined family influence could carry from one reign into the next. The Princess Royal argued that precedent was the true danger. Charles agreed. If one spouse received a permanent advisory role today, another spouse decades later could demand precisely the same privilege under entirely different circumstances. William finally understood why the language had hardened. Camilla received the explanation privately. The queen consort reminded Charles that she had stood beside him through years of controversy, hostility, and transition. He did not deny it. Instead, he acknowledged that was precisely why the decision was painful. He removed his glasses, set them beside Anne's memorandum, and said, "I could protect you personally, or I could protect the office permanently. I could not guarantee both." Camilla said nothing for several seconds. Then she closed the folder. Charles knew the silence was not forgiveness, but the king also knew he had finally spoken honestly. The decision had not been designed to erase her. It had been designed to prevent any royal spouse, present or future, from converting personal closeness into permanent authority. William left with greater clarity. Camilla left with less power. And across the wider family, the same reasoning that promised future stability was about to make. Several people realized how much influence they had already surrendered. The palace announcement removed no crown, canceled no title, and erased no one from the family. Yet by the following morning, several royals understood that something fundamental had shifted. Old assumptions about access, influence, and inherited importance no longer held. Some accepted it in silence. Others felt themselves pushed toward the margins. And inside Clarence's house, Camilla experienced the first unmistakable sign that the new order was already real. Camilla received a revised briefing schedule and read it twice. 3 future heir planning sessions she had expected to attend no longer carried her name. Those sessions were private meetings used to prepare younger royals for future responsibility, including how George, Charlotte, and Louis would be introduced to official duties and shielded from competing influence. She folded the page once, set it beside her tea, and said quietly, "So it has already begun." The queen consort had understood the theory of the protocol. Now she felt its weight in practice. William saw the consequences from a different angle. Palace staff had reorganized future discussions so they centered on him, Catherine, Charles, and specifically designated advisors tied to the direct line. The prince had wanted clarity around his children, but Catherine understood that clarity could still wound people. She felt sympathy for Camilla. Losing access could feel like losing trust. Still, she refused to mistake compassion for uncertainty. Her children needed clear boundaries now, before old loyalties hardened into future disputes. Anne supported that view. According to a documented private account circulated after the restructuring, the Princess Royal reminded Charles that affection could survive without becoming institutional authority. She believed the new order preserved relationships by stopping them from becoming claims. The king accepted that reasoning, though he also recognized why Camilla felt diminished. For Charles, every clean boundary on paper seemed to produce another emotional fracture at home. William then encountered the clause that altered his own perspective. Once George became an adult working heir with his own household, the future king would be expected to observe the same boundaries now being placed on Camilla. He could counsel his son, but he could not treat parental closeness as permanent authority. The protocol did not simply push royal spouses outward, it prevented every generation from controlling the one that followed. That realization unsettled William. The prince had believed he was shielding his children from interference. Now he understood the rule would one day shield George from him as well. Camilla had lost access. William had lost an assumption. Charles had built a system that spared no one from its limits, and that changed everything. William no longer wanted another conversation shaped by secretaries, memoranda, or palace language. He wanted to speak with Camilla alone, without Charles standing between them. But when he finally did, the conversation moved somewhere neither had anticipated. For days, every exchange had been defined by titles, protocol, and authority. This one was different. William approached Camilla without advisors and without a file in his hand. She had already lost the argument over formal influence. He had already secured the protections he wanted for his children. Yet neither felt victorious. What followed was the first conversation in which they stopped defending their positions and spoke instead about what they feared losing. William now understood that the protocol would one day constrain him as well. The prince had learned that once George established an independent royal household, even a father's influence would have limits. That knowledge shifted the tone of the meeting entirely. Camilla had also come to accept something painful. Charles was not going to reverse the rules. The queen consort could challenge the emotional cost, but the structure itself was permanent. For the first time, they were no longer debating whether the decision would survive. They were trying to understand what it had taken from each of them. William spoke first about George. He admitted his strongest reaction had never truly been about power. It was fear. The future king had watched how royal expectations could swallow childhood piece by piece, turning every relationship into preparation and every kindness into influence. He did not want George surrounded by adults competing to shape him. He wanted Charlotte and Louis shielded from the same weight. Camilla listened without interrupting, because she finally understood that his resistance had come from memory as much as authority. Camilla then answered with her own fear. She told William that her anger stemmed from imagining what would happen after Charles was gone. She had spent years constructing a public role beside him, weathering hostility and earning her place within the household, only to face the possibility that history might treat her as temporary. The queen consort did not ask for control. She asked not to be forgotten. William gave her the answer she had not expected. The prince said the protocol limited institutional authority, not personal memory. According to a documented account of the private conversation, he made clear he had no intention of pretending her place in his father's life had never existed. Camilla heard the difference immediately. She then made her own choice, withdrawing her private objection to the protocol and ending the resistance that had threatened to divide the household. The decision did not restore her authority. It restored something quieter. Understanding. William stood to leave, but she stopped him. Protect them better than all of us protected you. He paused. That is the point of this. By sunrise, the private conflict had softened, but beyond the palace gates, the announcement had grown into something far larger, a national debate about blood, marriage, power, and who truly belongs to the crown. The family had spent days arguing over what the protocol meant inside palace walls. The public reduced it to one raw question: who truly belongs to the royal dynasty? By morning, broadcasters were dissecting every clause, newspapers had turned bloodline and marriage into front-page conflict, and crowds outside Buckingham Palace read the statement on their phones. What had begun as an internal safeguard had become a national argument about the monarchy's future identity. Charles watched the coverage with growing unease. The king knew the legal succession had not changed, yet the public conversation made it sound as though entire branches of the family had been cast aside overnight. The protocol had instead tightened ceremonial and internal dynastic roles around the direct line, meaning influence over future heirs would follow clearer boundaries even while titles and family relationships remained intact. That distinction mattered, but nuance was disappearing beneath outrage. Some commentators called the reform long overdue modernization. Others called the emphasis on bloodline cold, even cruel. William refused to treat the moment as a triumph. The prince told Catherine privately that protecting George, Charlotte, and Louis should never be presented as a defeat for Camilla or anyone else. She agreed. Catherine understood why the boundaries mattered, but she also recognized how swiftly institutional language could become personal humiliation in public debate. William had fought for clarity around his children. He did not want that clarity turned into a weapon against another member of the family. The reaction outside Buckingham Palace captured the divide precisely. A crowd gathered beneath the gates as a major evening broadcaster carried the headline, "Bloodline Before Marriage." One woman held her phone open to the palace statement as people around her debated whether the monarchy had finally modernized its internal structure or retreated into something colder. The moment spread rapidly, reducing a complex royal decision to a single emotional conflict everyone could grasp. Charles then heard the phrase that stopped him. A television debate described the protocol as royal exclusion. The king reached for the remote and switched off the screen. He looked toward William and said, "Tomorrow, they need to hear what this actually means from us, not from a headline." The palace briefing that followed clarified something even more significant. The rules would apply across generations. Catherine would face limits. William would face limits. George, when his time arrived, would face limits, and so would his eventual spouse. This was not a punishment directed at any one person. It was a framework designed to stop any generation from holding permanent power over the next, and with public frustration still rising, Charles prepared one final family meeting, not to rewrite the rules, not to defend his reasoning, but to deliver the conclusion everyone inside the monarchy would have to live with. The final meeting contained no argument because the argument was already finished. Charles had made the rule. William had understood its cost. Camilla had accepted its limits. Catherine knew what it meant for her children, and understood why the decision could not remain unwritten. For the first time since the announcement, the family was no longer fighting over who had lost influence. They were confronting a deeper truth. The monarchy had chosen clarity over personal entitlement. Charles gathered them one final time and confirmed that the royal lineage protocol would stand without revision. The king made clear that the legal succession remained untouched, because the document did not determine who inherited the crown. It defined responsibility, ceremonial authority, and access around future heirs. That distinction mattered because George, Charlotte, and Louis would retain their place in succession while the adults surrounding them would now face clearer limits on how far personal influence could extend. Camilla heard the hardest part directly. Charles acknowledged that she had surrendered the most immediate institutional influence under the new rules. The queen consort had accepted years of duty beside him, yet she would no longer carry automatic authority into the next generation. William listened carefully, because he now understood the same principle would eventually apply to him. Once George formed an independent royal household, the prince could not assume that being his father granted him permanent authority. William told Charles he no longer viewed the protocol as something written for his benefit. He saw it as a boundary placed around every generation, including his own. Catherine understood what that meant for their family. Protection was not the same as privilege. Her children were being shielded from outside influence, but their parents were also being reminded that one day they would have to step back. Camilla then ended the last resistance. According to a documented account of the private meeting, she told Charles she would not challenge the protocol again. Her place beside him, she said, did not require authority over what came after him, and agreed. The Princess Royal reduced the entire episode to one truth. The crown belongs temporarily to each generation, but no one owns the generation that follows. Charles signed the final internal confirmation and set the pen down. Camilla remained beside him. William did not reach for the document. Catherine looked toward her husband. Anne quietly closed the file. Nothing more needed to be resolved. The king had protected William's children, but he had also restricted William's future authority over theirs. Camilla had lost institutional influence without losing her place in Charles's life. Catherine's family gained clarity without triumph. The protocol began as a family dispute. It ended as a final statement of principle. You may inherit the crown, serve beside it, and shape your own generation, but the future does not belong to you forever. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.